Pass rush or coverage? Which spot is the bigger priority for the Falcons to address in round one?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. And right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for too many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I think each and every one of you that is an everydayer that tunes in to this illustrious show as your first listen or first watch of the day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, I am joined by Josh Kendall of The Athletic. And we'll be talking about the Falcons' first round options, whether or not they can stick with their best player available draft strategy, or will they have to focus a little bit more on need and sort of what is really going to move the needle in terms of raising expectations for this football team beyond just being a team that can win the NFC South. And we'll get into all of that with Josh Kendall of The Athletic right now. Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast. And of course, we are joined by an illustrious guest. He is Josh Kendall, who covers the Atlanta Falcons for The Athletic. And we last had Josh on the podcast right after the Super Bowl, and then we talked about offseason priorities, and we mentioned how it all kind of started at the quarterback position, and of course the Falcons have since been able to secure their quarterback in Kirk Cousins. But I also asked Josh about what were their other offseason priorities, and Josh mentioned pass rush and upgrading the secondary, maybe adding another weapon or two on the offense. And they haven't really done that other than add a couple of receivers, which they've done. But I suspect those other areas still remain areas of need. And do you expect the Falcons to kind of fulfill and fill one of those spots in round one? Is there one particular spot that you have sort of circled as a first round option, or a particular prospect maybe that you're leaning towards them taking at 8th overall?
Well, our last conversation, we said they've either got to make a big splash. I still feel like they got to make a big splash at quarterback and at pass rush this offseason. And so you can either do it one of two ways: quarterback in free agency or pass rush in free agency. They obviously went quarterback. So I think that leaves them the most obvious option as pass rush help. Your listeners who follow my stuff will note that I have done a couple of mock drafts with Quinyon Mitchell, the cornerback, as the number one option there. I've done that for a couple of reasons. My deep and undying love for Dean Pease, whose philosophy always was, if I have to choose, I don't want to choose, but if I have to choose, I want an elite cornerback because I can create pass rush more so than I can create lockdown coverage. So if I have to pick, and I don't know where Raheem Morris falls on that spectrum, but we did see this group in Los Angeles, this defensive group in Los Angeles, get 17 sacks out of second and third round. What were Young and Kobe Turner? Third round picks, right?
Yeah, something like that.
Last year for the Rams, they get 17 sacks out of these guys. So that goes back to, we don't have to have an elite guy there or a guy who's considered elite outside of our building to generate some pass rush there. So I still think it's possible that Quinyon Mitchell, Terrion Arnold is the first pick for the Falcons. But then you go Dallas Turner and Latu from UCLA, obviously are also options.
Now, there's been a lot of talk in recent weeks about the Falcons potentially trading back in round one. And I feel like one of your mock drafts that you've done recently, you had them doing exactly that. I'm just curious, expand on some of the reasons why you think that's a legit possibility for the Falcons.
Well, I think that their pick is valuable. And one of the reasons that I was a proponent of getting a quarterback in free agency, specifically Kirk Cousins, because he was the most high-profile guy out there, is let's imagine you're the Falcons right now and you're sitting here and you still need a quarterback. And you're at 8, and 1 and 2 are going to be quarterbacks, almost certainly 3. I still think it's probably going to be a cornerback. And, Denver and Minnesota are very incentivized to go get that number 4 or 5 pick. That's going to make it expensive. So every time somebody gets pushed, somebody elite gets pushed down the draft order, offensively elite, whether it be a quarterback or a wide receiver, the value of the 8 pick goes up. And we just talked about the Falcons' needs. If you are the Falcons and you sit there and you say, we really like Quinyon Mitchell, we really like Arnold, we really like Latu, we really like Turner, and we feel like any of those guys could be a fit for us, or maybe there's another guy that's on their board that we don't even know about. We feel like those guys could be a fit for us, and they're going to be available at 12. We're not talking about moving down far, but Minnesota and Denver are going to pay elite prices for the number 8 pick if there's a quarterback available. If one of those 3 wide receivers is available at the top, somebody else may pay that kind of price. So the Falcons could very well feel like we can go as far down as 15 or so and still get the guy that we might have taken at 8 anyway and add some value. And if you can stockpile picks, do it.
So, guys, there's still more to come on today's Locked On Falcons with Josh Kendall, including whether or not the team will move away from their best player available draft strategy to focus more on fulfilling some of these needs and holes left to be filled on their defense as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp, and spring may be here, and it's usually the time that we can be a little bit more social, and that's something various points in my life I've had difficulty doing. And you wonder what's the right amount of socializing for each and every one of us. How do you recharge your battery? Do you thrive around people? Maybe you need a little bit more alone time, and therapy can help give you the self-awareness to build a social life that doesn't drain your battery. And one of the things my therapist has worked on me now that I've joined BetterHelp is trying to increase my social battery by getting me to try more new experiences. And part of that was a big part of me going to the Senior Bowl the last 2 years. I don't know if I would have done that without the help of my therapist. But if you're thinking of starting therapy, why not give BetterHelp a try? I cannot recommend it enough. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, suited to your schedule. All you got to do is fill out a brief questionnaire, and you'll get matched with a licensed therapist. And the great thing about BetterHelp is you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find your social sweet spot with BetterHelp by visiting betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Now, given you've mentioned some of these areas where they need to address on the defensive side of the ball, do you think, and I'm really circling 3 spots on defense: outside linebacker, cornerback, and safety, do they need to kind of focus this year's draft more on drafting for need than the traditional best player available mantra that GM Terry Fontenot has been preaching since his arrival 3 years ago?
No, I still think that they need to trend toward best player available. I think they are really hard. If you read through all of their transcripts, their public comments, they're really hard to nail down. And that's, on purpose. They're never going to sort of back themselves into a corner or really give you an idea of what they're thinking. But if you really dig into it, I think you see that they are still, at least Terry is still in his heart, a best player available guy. It's hard to know what lessons Raheem took from that Rams drafting strategy. I mean, they never had a first round pick when he was there. This is a team that took Stetson Bennett last year, kind of out of the blue. So we don't know, what lessons Raheem brings into this mix from that group. I still think you take best player available. You mentioned safety, and I agree they could use some safety depth, but this is not a great safety draft, at least at the top, I don't think. You'd probably know better than me at this point. But I don't reach for a safety if I can add an offensive lineman. If we're in the middle of the rounds, I'm still banging the table. I'm the only guy out here banging the table saying, the Falcons need to draft a tackle. Jake Matthews is not invincible. This is a guy entering his 11th year. You've got to address the lines of scrimmage, I think, every year. So if you're the Falcons and you're sitting there and you're in the 4th round and you say, we need a safety, but this tackle we think is a 2nd round guy, I think you go get the tackle.
And piggybacking off of that point, do you think there's a chance that the Falcons maybe hire on some of the sort of current options on the roster at some of those spots, like outside linebacker, where you have Arnold Ebiketie, Lorenzo Carter, D'Angelo Malone, cornerback, where you have Clark Phillips, Mike Hughes, and safety, where you have Richie Grant and DeMarcco Hellams? Is it a situation where maybe internally they're higher on their current roster than maybe some people are externally, and so they're willing to maybe roll into the season with some of these guys starting for them?
Yeah, I think that they'll certainly say that. Whether or not that's true or not, I think we'll learn as the offseason goes on, because there still is room after the draft. As you know, there's still plenty of free agents out there, veteran guys at most every position, especially safety. You look at the safeties that are still available on the veteran market. So I think that we will know entering training camp how they really feel about those guys. And it's not necessarily if they say they get through the draft, and they don't take an elite cornerback, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to add to that position again.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. We've seen this team be active post-draft, especially 2 years ago, where they went out and got Bradley Pinion and they brought in Eddie Goldman, although he didn't wind up playing for them, but they traded for Brian Edwards. All of those moves came after the draft. And so I guess if they're going to go best player available, it would make sense that, they still see an opportunity to go out there and potentially find some starters, in May and June and whatnot. So do you think that is also a sort of viable strategy for this team in affecting how they may approach the draft?
Yeah, I think that if you look, there's something available pretty much at every position of need for this team in the free agent market right now. So you're not in a position where you have to take anybody, I don't think, if you're Atlanta, which is the position you want to be in. And again, the Kirk Cousins move was the right move from my perspective for a lot of reasons. One of which being, if you're the Falcons and you're sitting here and you still don't have a quarterback right now, you're at the mercy of a lot of different things to kind of have to fall into that gap. The Falcons are no longer at the mercy of, I think, any of the market forces, which is a good place to be.
So we are continuing today's Locked On Falcons, talking with Josh Kendall about the elevated expectations for the Falcons season this year and what's going to move the needle more. Do they need to get the most out of the current options on the roster like Kyle Pitts and Arnold Ebiketie, or do they need to add more impact players in this year's draft? But first, I want to tell you about our sponsor, FanDuel, because right now it's April and the sports calendar is fully loaded. And FanDuel is making it even more exciting to get in on the action, because right now new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use on the NCAA tournament, Major League Baseball, the NBA, NHL, and so much more. And of course, you got the NFL draft later this month, right, where you can select who's going to be the 8th overall selection, or 1 through 8 if you're feeling fancy. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, and you can make your first bet a big win. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. Now, I want to talk with you a little bit about, how some of these offseason moves have sort of moved the needle for expectations this upcoming season. Obviously, the expectations have been and will continue to be for this team to make the playoffs this upcoming season. But do you feel like there's still room for this team to maybe even raise the expectations beyond that? Just, not just winning the NFC South, but, going possibly and being a contender in the NFC this season based around what they could wind up doing, later this month in the draft, as well as after the draft and free agency.
Yeah, I think so. I think you have raised your ceiling substantially with a veteran quarterback, and we can have the Kirk Cousins playoffs argument all you want, And I think Falcons fans will probably be pretty happy if they're sitting there in January having clinched a playoff spot and everybody's now turned to, can Kirk Cousins win a playoff game? If you get to that stage of the season for the Falcons, that's probably a win. But in the NFC, yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I don't think that, the Niners are clearly the class of the division. We don't know what the Eagles are going to be. The Vikings have taken a step back. Who else off the top of my head? Detroit obviously will be a hot name, but we just don't know. So I think that there's every reason to believe that if you get into the playoffs, and that should be the expectations, that this could be an NFC championship game type of team. And you get into a one-game situation, and who knows? If I was a Falcons fan, I would still, before I got that into my head, I would want to know, have we addressed pass rush in some capacity? And have we either added another wide receiving option who's a real help, or unlocked something in Kyle Pitts that makes him a true, third option in a three-headed monster? This is the three-headed monster of Atlanta's offense that we've been hearing about for a while that's never really materialized. Darnell Mooney, his best season is 2 seasons away. We have to see. So you've got guys here who could be that, but they haven't been that yet. So if you get there and then you get rolling and you find a nice place for Tyler Algier, which I think that this offense will, without taking away what makes Bijan special on however many number of snaps a game, and you get some pass rush, sure, why not?
Now, I'm curious, sort of you mentioning Kyle Pitts, and I'm wondering, do you look at sort of what kind of moves the needle for this team? Do you look at it more, okay, if they can really nail this draft and walk away with, potentially 3 starters? Because I know you go back to 2016, and I know you weren't covering the team back then, Josh, but like in that 2016 draft, they drafted like 4 starters with Keanu Neal, Deion Jones, Devondre Campbell, and Austin Hooper, that contributed pretty early on the football team that season. It was a big part of some of their success that year. Or do you kind of look at it where it's, as you mentioned, it's more about this team raising their ceiling if they can get the most out of Kyle Pitts, if they can get the most out of Drake London and Bijan, some of the pieces that they've already added that, as you mentioned, we've been hearing the hype on for, a year or more, and they haven't quite lived up to that. So where do you sort of fall on that? Is it more about getting more out of maximizing the current pieces, or is it more about maximizing the pieces that they haven't added yet in the draft?
For me, that's an easy answer. It's maximizing the pieces that they've currently got. This has been the plan for 3 years. 3 top 10 offensive skill position picks at different positions. You've now put the quarterback into the mix that you feel like can unlock, for lack of a better word, all of that. This is a point-scoring league still. That's what has to happen for this team to reach its ceiling. I think far and away that's more important than whatever happens at the end of this month in the draft. It's what's already happened, and can you make good on the bets that you've made the last 3 years in the draft?
Okay. Well, Josh, that's going to do it for us here. You answered all my questions. I look forward to seeing what this team does later this month. But let the people know, what are some of the things that you're working on in, the next, 3.5 weeks between now and the draft?
We'll look at depth charts and we'll break down. We'll do mock drafts. It'll be all draft-related content for this month, whether it be let's look at this current roster and see what it needs to let's look at this pool of players and I'll try to figure out, like we've done here a little bit today, where they're going to go.
Well, Josh, I really appreciate you joining us here on Locked On Falcons. I look forward to our future conversations as, this entire offseason wraps up and we can actually turn our attention to actual football later this summer.
That'll be fun. Thanks, Aaron.
All right, guys, I want to give thanks to Josh Kendall for joining us on today's episode. If you're curious on what your first watch or first listen is going to be on tomorrow's episode, we will be joined by Max Chadwick, the top college football analyst for PFF, to talk about the various prospects and potential fits for the Atlanta Falcons in the upcoming draft. And we'll wrap up today's episode by answering a question from one of our Locked On Falcons insiders. And for those of you that are interested in becoming a Locked On Falcons Insider, not only do you get priority when it comes to getting your questions answered on future podcasts like mailbags and Q&A episodes, but you also get access to all the film breakdowns that I do. This week, we will do a Laiatu Latu, the edge rusher from UCLA breakdown, and I'll illustrate, some of my concerns with Latu's game, and we'll probably wind up doing some of the other edge rushers, Dallas Turner and Jared Verse, between now and when the draft starts. And if you want to get more insight into those film breakdowns, I did the top quarterbacks, like the top 5 quarterbacks, or, I did JJ McCarthy, Michael Penix Jr., Jaden Daniels, Caleb Williams, and Drake May. We also did all 5 of the Falcons' offensive free agent signings, including Kirk Cousins as well. So check that out. If you want to become a Locked On Falcons Insider, join the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. It is a 14-day free trial, so you'll get the Laiatu Latu video for free, as well as potentially whoever I wind up doing next week. And then, it's $4.99 a month after that point if you want to stick around. And so check that out. But let's answer our question from our Locked On Falcons Insider. This is Cody, and he asks, I want to know your perfect draft scenario. So, Cody, I don't really have an answer to this one because my pre-draft process is mostly about, I want to know a little bit about a lot of players, and try to get insight into, potentially 100, 150 prospects, and just have a general idea of what type of skill set, what type of, scheme fit, all those types of things that a player brings. So I don't necessarily spend a lot of time to sort of build a draft board and come up with a perfect draft scenario, right? After the draft, then I'll go, then I'll want to know a lot about a few players, which is going to be, the 6 to 8 or however many draft picks the Falcons have. And I'll take a real deep dive and wind up watching anywhere between 6 and 10 games of each one of those guys if I can get my hands on it, as long as we don't, take any D2 guys like John Cominsky a couple of years ago, where I really only had access to like 2 games. But, then I'll take a deep dive on those guys through May and through the first half of June, and I'll know a lot about those players, and then I'll be able to sort of react and say, like, I don't really love this guy, or I really like this guy, and this is value, or whatever that case may be. So I don't go into the draft with a perfect draft scenario ever, really, at this point in time. I kind of learned my lesson from the 2016 draft, where I built up in my head that like Miles Jack was going to be the pick. You had the need at middle linebacker. You had Jeff Ulbrich, his former DC and linebacker coach at UCLA here in Atlanta, was like, oh, this is a match made in heaven. He's probably not going to fall to the Falcons at 16. I think they were picking that year. And he started to fall, and it was like, okay, we're going to get Miles Jack. And then we took Keanu Neal. And while I liked Keanu Neal more as like a second round pick, he wound up becoming one of my favorite players on those Falcon teams over the next couple of years. So like, that's part of the lesson I've learned is like, don't build up this sort of narrow vision of what the draft is supposed to be heading into the draft, because oftentimes whatever you think should happen is probably not going to work out the way that you think it is. That's the nature of the draft. It's a crapshoot. So I don't necessarily have a perfect draft scenario. Now, what I will say is, if you're asking me which pick the Falcons could make that would make me giddiest come Thursday night, is probably somehow landing on Malik Neighbors and getting him, the LSU wide receiver, at some point in the top 10, just because I'm a big fan of Malik Neighbors. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say he's one of the best prospects he is one of the best prospects in this draft, but like, it's him and Caleb Williams are like my 2 favorite prospects in the draft. I wouldn't say that they're, I think Caleb Williams is the best prospect, but I think Marvin Harrison Jr. of Ohio State is a better prospect than Malik Neighbors. But, I love me some Malik Neighbors. I was going to say something inappropriate, but I have been fond of his game for well over a year, and sort of circled him like last February as like, I want him in Atlanta at some point. And so that would make me giddiest that, occasionally as a Falcon fan, sometimes dreams come true. But even if they get that, like, I'm not sitting here going like, oh, Malik Neighbors is a guaranteed home run type of draft pick, because of probably the top, 7 or 8 guys in this draft class. If you're asking me, like, probably who has, besides a quarterback, I guess, who has the biggest, potential bust potential, probably is Malik Neighbors, just because there's certain elements of his game that aren't fully polished. And, some of those things tend to be issues at the next level. But all that to say, like, I certainly would be giddy if the Falcons drafted him, because if he does hit, right, like, you have the potential to have one of the best offenses in the NFL, assuming, Kirk Cousins plays the way that he's capable of playing, and Zach Robinson is as good a play caller as we think he is, and Drake London and Kyle Pitts and Bijan Robinson all live, like, you have the potential to have like a Cincinnati Bengals like 2021 offense with like Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and T Higgins and all those, Joe Mixon and all those guys cooking the way that they did that year, to the point that now, like, you're really a real Super Bowl contender in this next 2-3 year window that you have all those pieces together. So that would make me giddiest, but I wouldn't sit here and say that's a perfect draft scenario for the Falcons, right? It's just like, it is what it is, but we'll see how it all goes. I hope that answers your question, Cody, or I know it doesn't really answer your question, but that's about as far as I go. Like, I don't really spend much time or energy thinking about what's the perfect draft scenario or whatever. I'm just going to react to the draft, right? Like, the thing I know is, and I know this because I look at the analytics on the videos. Like, one of my most popular shows every year, is the Thursday night reaction to whoever the Falcons take it in round 1, right? Like, that almost every year I've done this, going back to the 2017 draft, that is in the top 5 most watched or most viewed videos or episodes, I should say, that I do here on Locked On Falcons. And so, like, I know, like, it's not really about what I think about a prospect going into the draft. It's really about, what you guys care mostly about, what I think about the player that the Falcons actually do draft, not the players that I think the Falcons should draft. Right now, we have to fill time between now and then, and so we will talk about the players I think the Falcons should draft. But I just know, like, the perfect, you're gonna care more about, do I think they hit a home run on that Thursday night episode, right? Rather than sort of me sitting here today and being like, here's what I think is, because a lot of it depends on who's on the board. Like, there's certain players, like, that are going to slide in the draft that you didn't predict they're going to slide, and like, oh wow, we got that guy when everybody thought he was going to go way earlier, and whether that's in round 1 or round 2 or whatever, so I don't necessarily, basically all that to say, I don't necessarily go into the draft with sort of an idealized version of what the draft could or should be, right? So there you have it, Cody. But that is going to do it for us here, guys. Make sure you continue to make us your first listen tomorrow. Check out Locked On Sports today, as well as Locked On Sports Atlanta, if you want to get the local insight here in Atlanta or in the state of Georgia, as well as the sort of local insight across the Locked On Podcast Network. On Locked On Sports today, get rid of those 4-letter networks like ESPN and whatever. Find a brand new 4-letter network, LOPN, the Locked On Podcast Network, with the Locked On Sports Today and Locked On Sports Atlanta 24/7 streaming channels here on YouTube, as well as the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Guys, it's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.